Good morning, Rhoda. How are you doing over in Inverness?
Good morning. I'm doing grand. It looks like it might be another nice day. Maybe not as nice as yesterday, but we live in hope.
And you've been doing the odd video conference over the last 10 weeks or so, haven't you?
Oh, just one or two. I seem to be living my life online these days. Between now that the Parliament's catching up with the new technology, we've got committee meetings happening virtually as well as sessions of the Parliament itself, but more meetings, meetings with stakeholders and people. Everything's happening on Zoom. Or Blue Jeans if you're the Parliament. The Parliament uses Blue Jeans, which
Okay.
is a
Uh-huh.
lesser known one, but I think it gives the clerks more control over the members. So
Yeah, yeah. And how have you found the dynamic of that? I mean, do you find it more difficult to ask questions and get questions answered?
I, yes, because it is probably more managed because it has to be. The people that are kind of chairing events need to know beforehand because you've got, especially with the Parliament, you've got your broadcast as well as just your meeting, so there's a few things that have to be pre-planned. um, so planning goes into it to make sure that we're covering bases and the like. And with the committee meetings, we also have a WhatsApp group for members that is
Mm.
running in tandem with the meeting. So if you want in to ask a question, you can WhatsApp the
Yeah.
convener. So you don't have to wave, whistle,
Mm.
or shout or anything like that. You just WhatsApp and say, "Can I come in on that?" And so there are ways of coming back, but it is, and you're not so aware of body language because you're
Yeah.
seeing, you're not seeing people in three-dimensional, and you're only seeing part of that. So, but it works and it allows us to keep moving and making progress and doing the work that we should be doing safely. And I think that's what most people in the world are doing right now, is trying to find a way of going on safely that protects people, but means that you keep going and doing the job you have to do.
And there isn't a date yet set for when the Scottish Parliament is going to physically sort of fully meet again, is there? Or what's the story there?
The Scottish Parliament has been meeting physically,
Yes, but mm,
because we don't have the ability to vote virtually as yet. They're trialing a number of systems that would
mm,
then mean we could go into a virtual parliament.
mm,
But we are not there yet.
yeah,
So we're hopeful of that. That can happen if there are no votes. We can have a virtual parliament
mm,
um, on a Thursday, for instance, in the afternoon. There are there are questions on various subjects, and those take place altogether virtually. Every single one of them is virtual, so that kind of works quite well. So we're making progress, and
mm.
I hope at some point it'll be fully virtual. But maybe by that point everything will have everything will be.
Who knows? Yeah,
Yes, we
yeah,
hope that things will be back to normal. Yeah.
yeah. And since you are, a national politician and an MSP, I am interested in your thoughts on Scotland's performance with the COVID-19 pandemic compared to the rest of the UK. I mean, I noticed, for example, this morning the Financial Times put out an article which was looking at excess deaths, which many epidemiologists, etc., think may be most accurate way of looking at the different performances of different countries and regions when it comes to diseases like this. And it looked as if Scotland had about a 53% or so increase in excess deaths during the pandemic. London was way ahead with 130%, higher than normal. But on the other hand, you had southwest of England, Wales, Northern Ireland, which had only about 40% or so. And then places like the northwest of England had 73%. So it doesn't really look as if Scotland necessarily has actually performed any better than most of the rest of the UK in general.
No, I don't think we have. I don't think we were prepared. In all honesty, there's lots of things that say we weren't prepared. Obviously, hospital beds and the lack of intensive care, the lack of equipment, and how you deal with the lack of PPE. I've got people I know people who were making PPE, kind of almost in their garden shed to try and help out. And that, was pretty grim. And to start off with, we were sending people on the front line into work without the proper protection. And I think we have to learn from that. And as we open up, we have to be very clear that people who are on the front line have the proper protection. And if you think of things like, your dentist isn't working, what happens? When other shops open up, we've seen how supermarkets have very quickly evolved from their normal to having screens up and much better protection for staff. So I really think we were not prepared. There was also the big concern, and I think this has led to excess deaths, is the way that people were kind of shipped out of hospitals into care homes. So care homes became the dumping ground for people. And at the start of the pandemic, it felt to me like older people were being totally written off. Um, colleagues had examples of people getting letters from their health board, it wasn't in Highland, saying to people, basically, there's a pandemic coming, click on this link to set up a do not resuscitate, click on this link to do your will, and click on this link to get a power of attorney in place, and don't darken my door again, was kind of almost the subtext, a pretty grim. Now, yes, people were afraid that there was a tsunami coming, but at the beginning there was kind of a bit of it seemed if you were disabled or elderly or in one of the most at-risk groups, you were being written off, rather than the at-risk groups, which were the ones that were more likely to succumb to the virus, being given enhanced protection. So had some of the folk that had been in care homes been taken into hospital, would they have had a better chance of survival? Was there oxygen available to help them through that? Some of the things that I've heard, the health boards are briefing MSPs quite regularly, and speaking to Grampian Health Board, they were saying, for the over 70s, there is a 90% chance of recovering from COVID-19. Who would know that? Nothing in the public sphere would lead you to believe that. And, it was almost like if you're over 70 and you catch this, you're finished. If you became ill enough to go into hospital, there was a 70% chance of recovery. So even if you were on a ventilator, now, obviously, if someone is very old and frail, you're not going to do that to them. That's inhumane. But, we know a lot of 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds that are pretty hale and hearty, even 90-year-olds, and people have recovered at that age from it. So were we too fast? Did the government think we can't cope with those and just wrote them off? I mean, there has to be a public inquiry into all of this to see what went wrong, how those things happened, and to make sure that, this can happen again. And the trouble is those things tend not to be in living memory. They come in waves, but we have to put something down for generations to come as to what we learn out of this and how we protect the most vulnerable in our society, because, it's only when we see them at threat and that we really appreciate what we have.
Yeah. And that perhaps also brings us a little bit on to the story about the information that was available to both the public and indeed to elected members like yourself from the individual health boards. There was certainly a feeling here over in the West Coast that we really weren't very clear as to whether there were any cases around us at all, whether they were all in Inverness, for example, or whether they were elsewhere. Were you getting more information as far as that sort of thing was concerned to give people an idea of where the outbreak was happening?
Latterly, yes. Not initially. Latterly, yes. And I was, I was up until that point. I was of the belief that people should know where those cases were. You know, that there should be full transparency and people should know what. The day I got the figures and the map showing where all those cases were, was the day of the outbreak in Skye. That day, if you lived in Portree, you would have thought you were as safe as houses because there were 2 cases in Skye. They weren't anywhere close to Portree. You would have been going about your business thinking, I can do whatever I like, I can mix with who I want. I am absolutely safe, not knowing that there was a mini pandemic on your doorstep. So up until that very point, I was kind of pushing for those figures to be made public. I was saying we need to know this. And what the health board said to me, and they were right, was if we put this out, it creates a false sense of security for people who think they are safe. Bear in mind, the only cases we're showing is cases that have been tested, and
there had been very little testing at that point.
Tiny amounts of testing, and if you were in a rural area, you know, you're sick, you have to find your way to Inverness to get a test. It's not going to happen. So it could have been raging in Betty Hill, but who was going to get to Inverness to get the test? You know, folk would have just gone to their beds and tried to take their paracetamol and lived with it. They weren't going to drive to get testing. So I changed my mind totally about that over the peak. Just because it was so vivid, and maybe just on the day when I saw it, it was a grim but vivid illustration of how it could be so misleading.
Yeah. And although you're obviously, a national politician rather than a councillor, have you any thoughts on what you've seen of how Highland Council has handled it and how they've generally been performing through the whole era? There have been some questions raised about the fact that they've suspended most of their meetings, unlike some of the neighbouring councils.
I think this is a time when elected members really have to be on top of their game, to be honest. I think you need to be watching what is happening in your name, and I've heard in other councils things that aren't working well, that really should be scrutinised by councillors. So I think, councillors have a role to play. Now, I think I have to be admit, like everybody else, that our councillors tend to be older men who are probably the most vulnerable group of people in the pandemic. So there has to be ways of working that protect them as well, because you're not really wanting to put people at risk, but there have to be ways for councillors to carry out their duty. They were elected to do that. Now, I've had lots of complaints about the council, obviously, because my, Scottish Government, council, every level, people come to me when they've got a problem and they're not getting an answer. So I get that. I get from the council that they're waiting for advice from Scottish Government and information from them. So that everybody, and again, I'd say we were caught on the hop because people are making it up as they go along. And to a huge extent, and struggling with all of this. So, it is a time, and I suppose my frustration as an elected member is trying to get that information from my constituents. People are coming to me saying, I need your help, I need you to sort this out for me. And, it's much faster than you need in normal times, because these are urgent questions for everybody. So things are better now. At the beginning, we were really struggling to get the answers people needed, and that was really frustrating.
And you're saying to me earlier that, your casework volume has actually been even larger than normal, particularly in the early stages. What sort of things have people been bringing to you? What sort of issues?
Lots of issues. a huge amount of casework, a lot about furlough and people falling through the cracks there, a lot about advice, should people be working, should they not be working, a lot, just a lot about health, people needing access to health services that weren't getting it, and testing. PPE was another biggie, people being expected to work without the right protection. So in a way, all of the things that you see out there, and then there was some quite different things, because it affects individuals in different ways. And certainly in the Highlands and Islands, we know that lots of people work more than one job. People can be working 3, 4 different jobs making a living. And because each of those jobs, in proportion makes a small amount of money, they were bringing, to someone else, so that's just like a sideline pin money, whatever. And they weren't being taken in the whole as a whole in the round. Those people needed support for each and every job. So if you had a B&B, if you had a self-catering accommodation, if you had a croft, if you then maybe had a part-time job as well, that's not unusual. And therefore they were kind of struggling to get the help they needed. So a lot of early on was to try and say, look, come on, you need to react to that, and take into account that people just don't fit into. And I'm not criticizing. Money had to get out. It had to get out quick. So there was a broad brush approach where kind of they got that out, and that helped a lot of people. But I think it created real fear for the folk that were missing out, because they thought, this is it, nothing's going to happen for me. And to try and say to people, be patient. How can you be patient if you don't have enough money to pay the rent or the mortgage and feed your kids? It's a lot of people are kind of one pay packet away from poverty. People aren't sitting there with huge amounts of money. We've come out of a recession, and a period of austerity, far too long. And if this tells us anything, is that austerity didn't work. We didn't invest in our health services. We didn't invest in our economy. We can't go back there again. The way you prepare yourselves is by investing and getting people to work. People work, they pay their taxes. You can build your public services, and that is the way forward. It's horrendous that it took something like this to show you that what governments were doing was absolutely wrong.
Yeah. So if you were asked to maybe pinpoint in particular the groups of people who maybe still haven't been reached sufficiently by the various support schemes, etc., what would you say there?
The people that rent accommodation are because you can get a mortgage holiday, it's much more difficult to get a rental holiday, so there has to be more for them. People who, as I say, work in different jobs, who are
Casual workers, etc. Yeah.
Yep, the newly self-employed are really losing out, and indeed people who have changed jobs and missed out on the furlough. Now, I've had some wonderful stories about employers taking people back, people who'd left, and gone to a different job, and had employers that's actually taken them back and furloughed them, above and beyond the call of duty. I've had other people where their employer has not furloughed them, they've been paid off just because this is a great opportunity to restructure your workforce, and not really caring about the people. I think we have to realise in something like this, we all have a responsibility to each other, and you do what you can. And I suppose I'm lucky I've seen the best of it. I'm lucky I've also seen the worst of it.
Yeah. You may not have an insight into this, but one of the things I've been curious about is whether the kind of community responses in the more rural parts of the Highlands, where I'm obviously based, where there's been a big effort to try and make sure that people are getting food, that there are sometimes local hardship funds in places like Coyoch and indeed elsewhere. In Inverness and Dingwall, Tain, Honest, etc. Has that kind of response been working as well? Have there been maybe more people slipping through the cracks over there?
I think that there is a good community response, but I think the thing in an urban area is it's not so visible.
Mm.
You know, in a small community where everyone knows everybody, you don't have to go and ask. People know who's going to be struggling, so people reach out to them and offer to help and kind of point them in the right direction. In an urban area, unless you reach out, and people tend not to until they're in a desperate position. People don't. So people have been trying to do things, you know, locally. You know, you're getting leaflets through the door, your church groups, and you know, the various community groups are really trying hard. It is harder for them though without that knowledge of everybody. And I think in a more rural community that there's just a culture of helping out. So it doesn't feel like you're asking for help. It just is what people do for each other in a rural area. And it is much more, people are used to helping each other out. You have to survive. That's part of the culture. So it doesn't feel like you're asking.
Okay. And we're now on the threshold of the next phase with, I think there are announcements maybe today, and we are moving into perhaps phase one, isn't it? But one of the things that's dominating discussion over here, certainly on the West Coast, is the tourist industry, what sort of pace of reopening we should be seeing, whether all of it should be reopened about the same, or whether, you know, we should be more cautious and wait a bit longer. What are your thoughts on that whole question?
I think you know, I'm getting a fair amount of pressure from people saying, you know, we should open up. Now, to me, there are places that could probably open up reasonably safely. You know, things like caravan parks where you've got owner occupiers and they have a shop on the site, and you know, people can be self-sufficient without bringing a threat into the community. I think things like that could be looked at. But I also know that in communities, kind of rural, remote communities where there's an elderly population, I've been contacted by people who own self-catering accommodation who are kind of saying, no, you know, I'm being pressurized to open up. I am not willing to open up because people who are going to be staying in my cottage are going to go into the local shop. There are vulnerable elderly people using that same local shop, and I don't feel I'm ready to do that. Now, that's people whose livelihood depends on that are actually that concerned. So that's not something I take lightly. I hear loud and clear that there's a lot of fear there if they're concerned about their livelihood. So I think there needs to be a more nuanced approach. I think, you know, I go to Edinburgh, I go to the Parliament. I'm one of those people who does travel and goes to work at this point. You know, in Edinburgh, you could probably stay in self-catering. There are supermarkets, there are takeaways. You could probably wander up Arthur's Seat and do some of those touristy things in self-catering without risking anybody. If you go, you know, to a small village on the west coast where there is one shop, then one, you're going to be putting pressure on that shop because you're going to be buying goods there, and already those shops are coming quite a lot under pressure because people who would have gone, you know, to Inverness Dingwall for their shopping, to Aleppo for their shopping, are shopping more locally because they don't want to travel about. So you're putting more pressure on that local shop. But you're also using the facilities there, so that, and there is less healthcare. That's what people who all wanted to head for their Highland home, you know, and sit out the pandemic in what they thought was safety, don't realise that if you need a test, you know, you have a long distance to travel. If you need A&E, you have a long distance to travel. You know, people who live in these areas are used to that, but we also know that those health services can't stand that kind of pressure of a summer population, and if there was an outbreak in one of those, we wouldn't cope. So we just have to be careful and look at what is available locally, what can people withstand, and if it was one wee holiday cottage, then fine, you could probably manage that. But given a lot of the most beautiful areas on the west are kind of their population double over the summer, then they can't cope with that at this moment in time.
Sure. There was one piece, I think, some survey which said that 60% of Scots, and of course most of those Scots would be in urban areas, want to go to the Highlands once lockdown is relaxed, which, yeah, that could be quite interesting if it happened.
Well, if it happens, it will, because people are being told that if they fly, they're going to have to isolate for 2 weeks after they come back. Not very many people are going to get 4 weeks holiday over the summer, so they're 2 weeks in Barbados or or Benidorm, whatever they can afford, is not looking very likely. So people want a holiday. Where better to come than the Highlands? But the Highlands, you just have to be careful that you don't damage what you want to see by doing that.
Okay, and finally, since we actually know each other, first of all, through crofting, do you have any thoughts on the impact of the pandemic on crofting, on the whole sort of sheep and suckler cattle world? And again, we've alluded to the fact that a lot of crofters, of course, are part-timers and have been depending on bits of tourism, etc. Plus, there's in some quarters been arguments that maybe this is the time to produce more local food, more food resilience, etc. Any thoughts on that whole general impact?
I think there are threats as well. I think getting produce and animals to market. A lot of crofters are not finishing their stock. They're selling them on to be finished, and that just lockdown and the ability to get good prices and things like that is probably more difficult. But there are opportunities, because I'm seeing it myself. Anyone who's on Facebook is seeing that people are beginning to sell locally. You can probably get more shellfish than you ever could because it's not going to the Spanish markets. It's available locally. The same with produce. So if people are growing crops or animals, it would be good to be able to make the most of this opportunity and market. And I was speaking to the Scottish Retail Consortium this morning and asking them about, how we get people online to be able to sell that wouldn't normally just, either sell in a shop or sell onwards. I think we need to do more about that, because actually we'd all like to buy locally. It's finding out where that is, and often that's word of mouth. So I think there are big opportunities if people can grasp them. And I think people now know there is a danger in being too dependent on things that come in from abroad. You are much better to have those facilities as local as possible so that you can be self-sufficient.
So do you think there's maybe an opportunity there for Scottish Government to seize this opportunity and give it greater support, perhaps?
I would hope so. I think we need to look, as I say, everything was rolled out as an emergency. I think going into the next phases, we have to give more thought about what we can do, how we can do things differently to allow people to operate. And, we see things happening more online. I think we need to allow people, and this is happening in some places where people have kind of come together and set up a website for produce from that local area. And I think it would be a good idea that more communities do that. And rural communities are active with a bit of support, with some help in marketing and how you get things through PayPal and stuff like that to make sure that you're secure and that people have confidence in buying through you, because I think that's really important. I think that could be a real opportunity.
And abattoirs, of course, is one of the perennial questions there. More small local ones or mobile ones, do you think that's possible?
I think it has to be, because again, at lockdown, that is an issue about, getting animals away. And I think that's been an issue for a long period of time. We need either mobile or small local, and that's not getting rid of, animal welfare. We just need the animal welfare regulations to recognize that you would be doing this in a smaller way, so that you make the regulations can fit anywhere,
Yeah.
anything. If there's a will, there's a way.
And there's
Look at
probably less stress, some would argue less stress on the animals if they're traveling shorter distances, or the abattoir is coming to them, etc.
Yes, of course there is. Of course there is.
Okay, Rhoda, I'm afraid that I may be cut off in Zoom any moment, and maybe I won't be. But yeah, I think that's been a really interesting chat, and it's been nice to cover a wider range of topics, perhaps, than some of our more hyper-local interviews that we've been tending to do up to now. So I really appreciated your taking the time this morning.
It was a pleasure.
Great.
So happy to do it again anytime
Well,
you.
yeah, we may well come back to you, because I'm sure there'll be more questions that arise at different stages of the whole world in front of us over the next however long year or so. So
And
thank you.